this is the original sketch. It's not the engraving. The engravings are in the books. This is the original hand-drawn sketch. And in this case, it's a picture of Fort Sedgwick, known as Fort Hell. And of course, during these operations, the lines still need to be held, John, didn't they?
Right.
And so tell us a little bit about, about Fort Hell, as far as you know, and what needed to be done to hold the lines while the operations went on.
Well, fewer men were needed to hold the fortifications. That's why there were so many fortifications. The ideas of both the combatants at Petersburg were to flank one another. Most of the fighting took place on the flanks. There was attrition every day in the fortifications, but they were so formidable that very few attacks were launched on fortifications. There's one at the crater. I mean, this is after the initial assaults. Then there's the crater, and then finally there's the assault on April 2nd, but that was after the lines had already been broken out west of the city.
Okay. Now, we keep getting back to the Weldon Railroad. We've talked about the various battles on it. Why was that railroad important? I mean, why was that an object for Grant's campaign?
The Weldon Railroad connected Petersburg with Weldon, North Carolina. And at Weldon, North Carolina, two other railroads joined it. One from Wilmington, Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the last port closed to the Confederacy, the last operational port. It wasn't closed until, I believe, January 1865. And also another railroad ran to the deep south from Weldon. So it was a relatively important railroad, but it was a railroad that General Lee had written off on June 19th as indefensible because it was too close to the Federal lines. So it was important for the Federals to cut the railroad. They just took quite a while to do it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that had any reflection on what you said before about Grant and Lee being more conservative when fighting each other?
It was partially that, but it was another factor was that William Mahone, who had been the president of the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad and who had surveyed for the railroad around Petersburg, had become a division commander. And he started taking the initiative and using his special knowledge of the topography to defeat several Federal attempts to cut the railroad, particularly in late June, when he single-handedly routed the Second Corps, and then took a bite out of the Sixth Corps on two successive days, June 22nd, 1864, and June 23rd.
This is a single Confederate division.
Correct.
Defeating one plus Union Corps. Huh?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So Mahone's a very interesting guy, and he plays a big part in this book. It's a point where he starts to shine in the Civil War, isn't it?
Right. He had been a very undistinguished brigade commander in terms of fighting, but he became a leader in the fighting during the last year of the war.
Mm-hmm. And, okay. I want to throw it back to Chicago again, but I want to open up a discussion, get both of you to talk about one of the most important events that occurred in Chicago during the Civil War, and that's why we're going to first look at this oil painting that we have hanging on the wall. Now, this is an oil painting from life, and Dan discussed it last month. So if you're a loyal fan of virtual book signing and you watched us last month, then you learned a little bit about this painting by Charles Merck. Charles Merck was born in 1826. He's a portrait artist, and he worked in the employ of the famous photographer Alexander Hessler. And this is again an oil from life, so it's a rare artifact of U.S. history, but it's an artifact of Chicago history. And part of that is because of the provenance of it, and I'm going to ask you to ask for some commentary on the provenance. But it was painted by Merck in July of 1860, following a photograph that looks very much like it, and you can see Merck's signature there. It was then given to the Chicago Sanitary Fair and went into the possession, to some extent, of Mary Livermore, the great leader of the Chicago Sanitary Fair. Sold at auction to Colonel Roselle M. Huff, and Huff is one of the first great meat packers in Chicago history, and so he bought it for $62.50. If you're interested in the price today, just give us a call and we can start the conversation. But I promise you, we've already had someone offer us twice what it was originally paid for. And then shortly before his death, Huff gave it to Nathaniel Pegram, a Lincoln, Illinois resident, who displayed it in his home. It was later given to Paul Cousley, he's the publisher of the Alton Telegraph. It hung in the Alton Telegraph for a long time. And then belonged to Cousley's family until it was purchased by Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in the 21st century, and it may move into its the next step of provenance. But Ted and Eileen, tell us about Mary Livermore. That's where I'm getting at. Tell us about the Northwest Sanitary Fair and all of these people that touched and had possession of Roselle Huff's painting of Lincoln.
Well, Mary was a Chicago woman. She was remarkable, first kind of coming on the stage of history, when she's the only woman reporter at the Republican convention that nominates Abraham Lincoln. And the security guards there try to throw her out. The woman doesn't belong, with the reporters. And she said she did belong, and the reporters, who are an iconoclastic group, went ahead and rallied around her. And so she was able to report for the I think it was the Northwest. It was a Northwest evangelical newspaper. I forget the exact title of it that she was commenting for. But what's really remarkable about her is that she wanted to help out with the war effort, but when she had children at home, so she could only really be in Chicago or go away for short periods. So she went ahead and used her time in Chicago to try to build up the resources of the Sanitary Commission, which of course was like a cross between the Red Cross and the USO, in terms of helping Union soldiers. When they were out of money, she set up this idea of a sanitary fair, and they were remarkable. Following her example, these were organized all over the country, in Cincinnati, in Brooklyn, in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, raising millions of dollars to go ahead and help with the medical care of Union soldiers.
And so, and this led to these huge, remarkable city functions, right? Mm-hmm. Fairs, I guess, carnivals.
And it extended not just through Chicago, but to the whole hinterland. We have one document, or couple documents, from Miss Mary Hall, who lived in Joliet, who collected things and sent them and shipped them to Chicago's Sanitary Fair. And there was from all over Illinois and even the other Midwest states that were funneling things into Mary Livermore's organization. It was just a phenomenal thing that a woman was not supposed to know how to do, but she did it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the story. That's like the story of how our painting ended up in Mary Livermore's auction. So many other things that were gifted to her.
When she said that she was going to have this fair, it was all men who ran this organization. They said, "Oh yeah, sure, Mary." They thought she was going to have like a bake sale or something. And she had this huge network of women, and she had first rented out all the available public meeting spaces in the city to hold this fair in. And she still needed more space, and so she had another building built in the same kind of rapid style in which the wigwam had been built in a matter of
Donated
weeks.
wood.
With the wood from Wisconsin, and she went ahead and showed up at the work site. She had architect plans, she had all the materials together. She showed up at the work site, and the men were just sitting there. And she's like, this fair is going to be happening in a matter of weeks, you guys got to be working. I said, we can't work because you didn't give us a legal contract. You signed this work order, and you're a woman, and your name means nothing in law.
And so just like an earlier generation of women who were radicalized by abolition movement, realizing that they're not supposed to speak in public or do these organizational things, the Civil War does this for the next generation. That was Mary Livermore's experience, and many other women touched by the sanitary fairs, that women need legal rights, they need the vote. And so what are you fighting for? You're fighting for whose freedom?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we see.
So this fair then they had an art gallery, they had a shoe store, they had a men's clothing, women's clothing, they sold agricultural implements, they sold everything you can imagine. They even had a food court. It was like the first shopping mall.
Carrots.
that she went ahead and, but that's, imagine where that painting hung, was in the art gallery, and then everything was auctioned for the benefit of the soldiers.
How much did they make?
They made $75,000 on the first fair, and they thought that she was going to make maybe like $50 or $60, you know. So the only thing they said to her when she came with that check for $75,000, which is a hell of a lot of money in those days, they said to her, "When can you do it again?"
And then after that one, the women were the ones who were doing all the selling and dealing with all the customers coming through, and then at the end the men sat the ladies down and served them dinner.
It's gallant of them.
Yes.
We have another question from Larry in Linden, Michigan. Thanks again, Larry. And this one is for our Chicago scholars. And Larry asks, did the Civil War instigate railroad building in Chicago, or did it prevent it due to a lack of resources available?
Chicago was already sort of the rail center of the
Thanks,
West,
Larry.
really one of the rail centers of the nation before the Civil War. The Illinois Central Railroad is the longest railroad in the world, and of course emanating from Chicago and down to the Ohio River. So the war did not hurt railroad development. There wasn't a lot of new railroads built, but what happened during the conflict because of the Civil War was that Chicago began to get the car works and the boiler works, and then of course the iron forges and steel forges to make rails that brought heavy industry to the city.
Another interesting thing, to Chicago and Illinois and the railroads was our Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was a big advocate of railroads, and of course Lincoln was a lawyer for Illinois Central, and it was Stephen Douglas who really helped to build the Illinois Central. His idea was it was going to unite North and South and maybe be a way to tie the sections together, and then Illinois was also getting railroads built to the west, and of course during the war it's going to be the Transcontinental Railroad that Lincoln has Congress enact, and so he already laid the infrastructure for Chicago to really become a railroad hub of the nation. And so it was already there before the war, and then the war itself really pulls a lot of that together.
So so as Larry's asking, there's not really a cut in resources, there's a flood of resources.
Yes. Well, in Illinois, or Chicago is so prime too between northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with the iron ore and lumber industry up there, and then Illinois is full of coal in central and southern Illinois, and so it's just this perfect meeting place as well with these resources to develop the steel industry and the lumber needed for building cars, and so it really took advantage of the geography, its geographic place in the Midwest.
In so many ways, Chicago's just in the right place.
Yes, and the whole transportation, water routes, the Great Lakes, the Illinois-Michigan Canal connecting to the Mississippi Valley, and then you get the railroads, and Chicago is just the right place.
One of the things we do, because we are a bookshop, the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, is we do have books. And everybody I know would love to have a great library of first edition books. But for the purpose of what we're talking about today, I wanted to share some regimental histories, unit histories, because these are very important as primary sources, as Ted and Eileen talk about, but also these are the building blocks of books like John's. And these are the kinds of books that you consulted. I see them in your bibliography, and I see them cited throughout. And so these are these are the building blocks of books of battle studies, and so they're written generally by the veterans, written for the veterans, and so each of these books represents the story of a regiment. The 115 New York, the Iron-Hearted Regiment, the 1st Maine Cavalry, the 10th Massachusetts Battery, Hood's Texas Brigade, right here, Polly's book, the 4th New York Heavy Artillery, and then here, right in the middle of John's battle, on the East Coast outside of Richmond, the 39th Illinois Regiment. This is where we're going to bring bring the two books together.
Yeah.
A Chicago regiment and a Virginia battle, and indeed I'm going to put up John's dust jacket right here and see, here's the history of the book, and there's an episode at the Battle of Deep Bottom with a Chicago area soldier. He's going to win the Medal of Honor for capturing this flag. John, can you fill us in just briefly on the 39th and Yates phalanx, and then on this Medal of Honor event at the Second Battle of Deep Bottom?
Company G of the 39th Illinois was known as the Preacher's Company, and it was recruited in Tinley Park, Illinois. One of the soldiers was a man from Indiana named Henry Hardenberg. He went on to become the color bearer of the regiment. The regiment, the 39th Illinois, was known as the Yates Phalanx after Governor Yates, who pulled some strings in Washington to get the 39th admitted into service because Illinois had already filled its quota of regiments. The 39th was the only Illinois regiment in General Grant's army at Petersburg at this point. It had fought in the Shenandoah Valley and then down in Charleston, and it had fought in the Bermuda Hundred campaign. It was part of Butler's army and part of the Western Brigade of General Terry's division in the 10th Corps. On August 16, 1864, it was the central unit in an assault force to capture Confederate fortifications just north of Fussell's Mill, which is about 10 miles southeast of Richmond. In the initial assault, which was through about 50 yards of slashing in front of Confederate earthworks that were held by a single rank of a Georgia brigade, the Illinois soldiers, and there were some Pennsylvania soldiers and Ohio soldiers, were about 11 ranks deep against a single rank of Georgians. Hardenberg carried the flag for the Illinois 39th Regiment. He was wounded in the initial onslaught. Another soldier picked up the colors and carried them on. Hardenberg picked himself up, and after the regiment had broken through and went down the line, he captured the colors of an Alabama regiment after killing its color sergeant, and he was given a battlefield commission and the Medal of Honor. Both came posthumously, though, because he was killed on the Bermuda Hundred lines on the 28th of August. And now the dust jacket of the book is based on a Keith Rocco painting of Hardenberg's action, the original of the painting hangs in the Tinley Park Village Hall.
Okay.
Oh, really?
We have another question from the folks at home. Like I said, if you want to host the show, I'm all for it. And again, I love getting. We officially have an international show today because this is Wayne from Ottawa, Ontario. Thank you, Wayne. And Wayne asked about Civil War Chicago, and he says. Civil War Chicago contains primary source material by people who lived in Chicago. I was wondering if the book contains any material by Chicago residents who supported the Confederacy, particularly Confederate intelligence activities in and around Chicago.
Certainly.
Thank you, Wayne.
We do have some documents related to that. It was sort of a big deal at the time. But we have records from memoirs from Thomas Hines, who was a Kentucky cavalry captain who was captured during John Hunt Morgan's raid across the Ohio River, made it up to Canada, and then worked with Confederate agents in Canada to try to liberate prisoners at Camp Douglas. And the Canadian authorities, unlike our good friends in Ottawa today, could have been a little bit more cooperative than they were. In 1864, about 80 Confederate soldiers under Hines' command came to Chicago in disguise with the intent of trying to work with local people disaffected with the Lincoln administration to attack the prisoner of war camp. And it was that last part that didn't quite work, because the locals promised a good game. They took thousands of dollars of Confederate money, but never produced the fighting men to help with make the conspiracy a reality.
Well, we talked about Camp Douglas last month. We had David Keller on the program. So based on what you found on the documents you have, what did the people of Chicago think of Camp Douglas? What did they have to say about this camp, prisoner of war camp, if you will, for the most part on the southern side of the city?
Well, when the news first came that we were going to be prisoners, the Tribune scoffed at it, and the headline was, "What an absurd idea." And about less than a week later, there were 7,000 Confederates in the city. And so there was tremendous curiosity. In fact, when that first trainload of Confederates arrived, the citizens just completely intermixed with them, and a number of prisoners escaped there. Right? But they wanted to talk to these guys. What do you think you're doing? Why are you fighting this war? Others had family members, and these were distant relations from the South. So there was tremendous interest. And then later in the war, it becomes a tourist attraction.
And the other thing about Chicago, it never had the draft rights that New York did, or even, like Boston or some other northern cities. But there was a lot of conflict with enrollment officers. See, the Irish community in Chicago just did not support the war. It didn't make them copperheads. It meant that they didn't like Lincoln's policies, and they wanted small government, and they supported, the Democratic platform of Stephen Douglas. But when Illinois got to meet its quotas, and then the war's dragging on, and enrollment officers start going into Bridgeport or into what's now like Goose Island area, Kilgubbin, that was called. They just had a lot of resistance, and they were throwing bricks at the heads of enrollment officers. I think one was killed. And so there was just a lot of tension, but it never exploded like New York did. And part of it was just that the way the city officials went about, enrolling and getting names, and I think because, there was a war between the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times, a war of words, and there's a war in the wards, so to speak, and it was just an interesting dynamic of sorting out what is really at stake here, and the Irish community did, go off. It was one of the first regiments with Colonel Mulligan and in many others, and so it was. So there's a lot of interesting things going on.
I'm going to ask you a question now that I'm not going to ask you for an immediate answer. But both Ted and Eileen, think about if you could pick one document out of the book. If you could pick one document out of the book that gives a sense of what Chicago was like in the 1860s. Let us know what that is. But I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. Because I want to ask John about, we've talked about Butler, Grant, and Lee, and to some extent the Second Corps, which reflects on Winfield Scott Hancock. But there's another character in this book who's extremely important to it, and that is the Fifth Corps commander, General Warren, commanding there at Globe Tavern. Tell us a little bit about the performance of Warren in this battle, and maybe how that fits into what happens later in his career.
Warren performed well at Globe Tavern. In fact, he won that battle, but he didn't accomplish the goals that Grant and Meade had set for him, which were far more ambitious. They wanted Warren to drive straight up the railroad into the city of Petersburg itself and uncover the front of the Federals facing the trenches by the crater and take Petersburg. Warren, in the opinion of Andrew Humphreys, who was the chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac and who later wrote the Virginia campaign of 1864 or 1865, sided with Warren and felt that Grant and Meade caused a disaster on August 19th by pushing Warren into an area that he ought not to have gone, and proved that his judgment as the man on the spot was superior to that of Grant and Meade. So he performed well, but not well enough to satisfy his superiors, who were just demanding way too much of him and his corps.
Mm-hmm. And that became, to some extent, that had effects on him later. It had an effect on the opinion that his commanders had of him, I guess.
Right. Well, he'd had a long history, beginning with the Mine Run campaign in the previous year, where he disappointed Meade. Meade knew that Warren was right, and yet he held it against him. And Grant felt that Warren was the type of person who saw difficulties before they arose and was always giving his advice, unwanted advice, to his superiors. So they stored all this up, and eventually it came back to bite Warren.
Mm-hmm. Chicago in 1860. What's it like?
Well, you asked me about what would be a source that I would suggest.
Do you have one document that would give a sense of the city? Yeah.
And there was a journalist who worked for the Chicago Times by the name of Frederick Cook. And I think it's 1873, 74, he wrote a book called Bygone Days in Chicago, and it's basically a memoir of his time in Chicago during the Civil War era. Marvelous, marvelous book, and he was a very colorful writer and really knew how to characterize things. Does a wonderful job describing the sort of underclass of criminals in Chicago, prostitution, gambling, and vice, which is hard to get sources on, and so I very much admire that. But just the way the streets looked and the smell of the place. Marvelous book. Anybody who is a book collector and loves Chicago history would want Bygone Days in Chicago by Frederick Cook.
All right.
For me, it would be, I'm an Irish American historian, and so the documents pertain to the Irish because they're such an important part of the city. And a couple of documents, there was one on, it's really just from the the Chicago Tribune, about the enrollment and conscription. And, they go into this, little tenement. This woman's got boarders, and and they're saying she has to tell them the names, and she can't remember anything, and it goes on and on about how she's just making things up, and she's pulling their leg. I mean, she's hilarious, and I was trying to find, I can't read it for you, but it was then after a while, of course, they're threatening to throw her in jail, and they're all this, and then all of a sudden her memory comes back. But it was just, I think it just described, they describe, the simple poverty of this community, and and how people are just trying to make it. And here she's trying to protect the men she knows, and not send them off to war, and yet it's the Tribune does it in such a patronizing and condescending way that makes the Irish look ridiculous. And it's certainly the Irish were pulling their leg. They've got a great sense of humor, but it just, to me, it epitomizes kind of like this city on the make that just has this struggling working population who just emigrated here. They're like a dozen years away from the famine, and they're back in the midst of this terrible ordeal, and then being sent off to die, and it's just is how do they cope with it? And this document just tells me that. And then another one at the end of the book comes from Finley Peter Dunn's collection of Mr. Dooley, and it's years later, and everybody's observing Decoration Day, what's now Memorial Day, and and all the guys are going off and they're strutting around, some trying to fit into their uniforms, and Mr. Dooley, the barkeep, on Archie Street, just says no one remembers the poor widow who's going to put a little pot of geraniums, on her, husband or son's grave, and it was just like what a tragedy it was for such a downtrodden people, and their persistence.
All right. I'm going to show one more piece, one more interesting artifact, but if I actually asked you to address it, we'd probably have to talk for another hour. It's an artifact of the Columbian Exposition, the 1893 Columbian Exposition. As you see there, it's a medallion. It's a metal medallion, and it's a medallion of Libby Prison, the great Union prisoner of war camp from Richmond that was taken down and shipped brick by brick to Chicago, where it was rebuilt. But what I want to ask you, Ted and Eileen, is, Ted, you introduced the book as Chicago is, I forget exactly what you said, but it was as if the veterans had intentionally seeded Chicago with memories of the Civil War. Certainly the idea of importing Libby Prison from Richmond to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition is part of that. But an important part of your book, and my favorite part of it, is at the end you provide a tour, a Civil War tour of Chicago. So give us a sense of that part of the book. We'll look at the medallion, but if you could tell us about the tour part of the book.
There's no wigwam on it.
There's no wigwam on it.
We did stay away from the places that aren't there any longer. And certainly one of the highlights is, Stephen Douglas is the first Chicagoan to run for the White House, and the only one, really, until Barack Obama succeeds. But his tomb and burial is at Illinois State Historic Site on 35th Street and the Illinois Central Tracks. And right across from there is the old soldiers' home that was built with the money that Mary Livermore and the Sanitary Commission raised. And that's the most striking physical remnant of the Civil War in Chicago. But we have a number of the statues on the tour.
Monuments.
The Union Stockyard entrance gate. The stockyards are gone, but the memory remains.
Yeah.
The National Register of Historic Places.
All right. I have some chores to catch up on here at the end, but I want to show you the books, and first and thank Ted and Eileen and John for joining us. We're going to close up on these books here in a minute, but first I want to tell you what we have coming up on virtual book signing in our fall schedule. The next event is Saturday, October 17th at 1 o'clock. Sometimes this has been advertised at noon. Those people are lying to you. It starts at 1. Saturday, October 17th at 1. local time, Catherine Canavan will be here with Lincoln's Final Hours, and David Powell will be here with Volume 2 of his Chickamauga trilogy, The Chickamauga Campaign, Glory or the Grave. On Saturday, November 21st at noon, Jason Silverman will be here with Lincoln and the Immigrant. That's from the Southern Illinois University Press, Concise Lincoln Library. And then Todd Nathan Thompson, The National Joker, Abraham Lincoln and the Politics of Satire, also from Southern Illinois University Press. And then closing out our holiday season, something you're really going to enjoy this one, and you're going to want to get this for a holiday gift. James I. Bud Robertson will return to this table and join us. And he has a great book called After the Civil War, The Heroes, Villains, Soldiers, and Civilians Who Changed America. You won't want to miss Bud Robertson. He's a great guy to watch, a great historian. But for tonight, I want to thank Theodore Karamanski and Eileen McMahon, who brought us Civil War Chicago, Eyewitness to History. And I want to thank you, John Horn, for the Petersburg campaign. I want to thank Ohio University Press for helping get Ted and Eileen here. And I want to thank Savis Beatty for getting John here all the way from Tinley Park. And I want to thank you at home for joining us. Everybody that is in the shop here, now you have a chance to ask questions. As soon as we turn off the camera, you can come up and meet the authors. If you want to buy the books, they're available for purchase in the back of the shop. I want to thank you at home. I want to thank the staff of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. We couldn't do it without you, with all of the cooperation, all of the teamwork that makes this happen. Join us on October 17th. That's a Saturday at 1 o'clock for the next episode of Virtual Book Signing.